Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
And here we go. It's almost, just like a Christmas week here on The Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Dave Trafford here with you. And there's lots to talk about because, of course, as Keith Leslie will tell you, this is the most wonderful time of the year for the press gallery because we do have the AG's report, the Auditor General report. We've got the sudden resignation of Phil Verster. So that in and of itself will take up a good deal of oxygen today on the show. But we've also got the Ford offensive on Fox. He was making appearances on Fox television. So making the case for Team Canada, calling it Fortress Can-Am, I think was the phrase that he used. So let's get started and we'll get to it. Around the table, Keith Leslie is here from CHTV and, of course, a veteran observer at Queen's Park. Former Premier of Ontario is here. Kathleen Wynne. Our veteran pollster, John Wright, is with us. And, of course, he's a founding host of the show. And Tim Hudak, the former leader of the PC party here in Ontario. And, Keith, all I could think of was you all week long as the Auditor General was getting ready to dump 900 pages on the desk at Queen's Park because it'll wind down when the legislature sort of sits over the Christmas vacation. And I had a laugh. I heard somebody on the radio this week say, well, this is just, one of those things that will only happen in a moment because it will just have a flare and the media will catch on and they'll talk about what's in the AG report and then nothing will happen. But I know you well enough to know that on the quiet time over the holidays, that was your reading and you would dig in to find all kinds of stories that didn't make it in the first day.
My only complaint about the Auditor General's reports, they come out the first week of December every year. And as Dave says, it's like Christmas for reporters because there's so much in there. In fact, it's like a Christmas where you get too much stuff and you have to go back and find something later. Hey, look what I also found. So there's absolutely more stories to be dug out of there. As I say, my one complaint would be that there's so much each year. It's like 8 to 10, sometimes 12 different topics are reviewed. If the Auditor General, if the government would allow it, could issue one report a month, each topic would get a lot more news coverage and a lot more debate and a lot more attention that it deserves. I mean, one line that we're treating out of this, there was a whole report on it. This government spent $100 million, $103 million on advertising, more than any other previous government. And about 2/3 of it is just to promote how good the governing party is doing. So when you see all those sorts of things, I mean, there's a lot there to be dug into, but for the most part, what we're going to hear about and what we heard about is, of course, the Ontario Place fiasco, the ministerial zoning orders. I mean, these two things together, you would have thought that this government had learned from the Greenbelt fiasco when they took, lands out of the Greenbelt with no real reason. It would seem to be politically motivated. Some people were treated with favors, got more information than other developers. They had to backtrack. They had to go to turn all those lands back into the Greenbelt. And here they are giving out ministerial zoning orders in pretty much the same way. And even the Ontario Place redevelopment, there were some proposals got to meet with the staff in the Premier's office, staff with Infrastructure Ontario, but others didn't. So the fact that they still have no procedures in place to properly deal with this sort of thing after that damning Auditor General's report last time, the previous Auditor General, which of course led to the RCMP investigating what's going on, a cabinet minister's resignation. This report just doesn't seem to have the weight behind it that's going to result in that sort of thing, even though the NDP are demanding the resignation of the infrastructure minister. I don't think it's going to happen. But there's a whole lot of meat here, and a lot of it just gets lost in the shuffle of the big headlines about, Ontario Place, the cost of redevelopment is now up to $2.2 billion, and it was going to be 745, I think, when we started. These sorts of things, they each deserves its own story, but so much gets wrapped up. So as I said, I'd really like the government, and they'll never agree to this, to let the Auditor General release one report a month as opposed to this once a year.
Well, just even on the MZOs, John, we also found there was no protocol and no apparent rationale for prioritizing some MZO requests over others. And that was sort of a thread in terms of the narrative, that there wasn't a whole lot of guardrails or guidance around some of the decision making. They talked about the lack of evidence-based decisions on the injection sites, and all of it. I mean, I'll ask you, when was the last time you saw an AG report at Queen's Park that was not, quote, in the headline, scathing?
Well, yeah, and it happens for every opposition leader loves that day when it comes down. And every premier, I think the premier was not in the House to answer any questions on the day. Oh yes, he was doing Fox News. Look, I think there's a few things about this, and we've talked about this before in this podcast. I mean, the Ford government is a retail political outfit. And when you have that sort of thing, it goes door to door, it makes decisions on the fly, it seems, in almost every case. And so I've always wondered why there isn't more process, why there doesn't seem to be somebody who steps into the room and says, maybe we should take this a step at a time, and or is it a little bit like some kind of a Shakespearean play where some drunk king is sitting at a table and says, I wish that guy wasn't around, and does it in jest, and then all of a sudden everybody else just goes out and executes the orders. So it's a process issue with this government, but there's two other things that also are important. Number one, how we can spend $2.2 billion on that project. And the second thing is to give away another $3.3 billion in pocketbook money. And you end up with, over $5 billion that could be spent on things like, and you can pick a topic, but I'm going to go back to the long-term care where we've got this huge crisis coming down the railings on us. The third point on this, though, is also the details of the lease are just incredible. Like I don't know how you can negotiate something like this, which in fact doesn't look like a negotiation, and especially for something like Ontario Place, where we've undergone all of this work at that site. Let's just remember why it ended up the way it is, and that's when Bob Ray came in and they decided to put the Budweiser stage there. No one went to the forum. That is the reason people went to see the show and then left the site as opposed to going in. So in each of these cases, it's been the private sector who in fact has turned that place upside down.
And I agree. I just think that there's so many worms in the can, and I'd be curious to get, your own perspective on this now, Kathleen Wynne, because I always question. I get why the media loves this. I get why the opposition loves this. The outcomes in terms of recommendations from the Auditor General and action on them are limited at best. I heard the ministers stand up in the media gallery this week, and essentially the standard answer was, well, we don't agree with the Auditor General's interpretation or the actual stance that she's taking, or her view of how this is unfolding. And that's not typical. That's not atypical. That's not something that just the Tories are doing. You guys did it when you were in government too. So what's the efficacy of having an accountability officer if there's no accountability for what's in the report?
Well, you know what? I'm just going to push back on that a little bit, Dave, because if you read the report and you see what the ministries have said in response, because remember, there's a whole briefing process that goes on before the AG report is released. And one of the things that I always wanted to know was that that the ministries had a response to the AG's recommendations, that there was the possibility of a plan to implement the recommendations, and there's follow-up on those things, so the AG will report on what has happened since the last report in a particular ministry. And actually, you're right, when we were in office, we did push back against Bonnie Lysyk, who was the AG at the time, on a couple of issues, because all of the accounting professionals in the accounting universe that we were in touch with disagreed with her assessment. This was about a particular treatment of a union fund, pension fund. But usually, and Tim can correct me if I'm wrong, but in my experience, usually governments stand up and say, we accept the recommendations of the Auditor General, and here's what we're doing to ameliorate the situation. I think the difference with this government, and particularly this report that we're talking about, is that the issues that have been highlighted are things that, as Keith has said, one would have thought the government would have dealt with. given the gas plant situation, there you go. Freudian slip. But we learned from what happened there. We learned what had gone wrong there, and you didn't hear anything more on my watch. We didn't have that kind of pushback in terms of our processes. But in terms of the Greenbelt, one would have thought that the government would have learned from that, and they haven't. The processes or lack of process that is highlighted in this report is pretty egregious on all sorts of files. It's on these safe injection sites, it's on Ontario Place, it's on the ministerial zoning orders. And finally, I'll just say to the point about surely there's somebody who could go in the room and say, wait a minute, you're on the wrong track. That does happen, and the Auditor General says that. She says that, when the ministry pushed back on ministerial zoning orders, they were overruled. Their advice was overruled, and the minister basically made the decision, which means the Premier's office was making the decision. So I think that there's a theme in this AG's report that is different than other governments, and that is the rules are being broken and nobody seems to care.
Or on the other hand, Tim, whether the rules are being observed, or if there are any firm rules to follow, because there is that hint in this report. I mean, the ministerial zoning order is a good example.
It's a significant vulnerability for the Ford government. I think the most that they will face in the time ahead. I had 3 points here, Dave. And first, since Premier Wynne brought up let the gas plant scandal out of the box, Keith is probably sick of the $1 billion gas plant boondoggle. Man, that came right back into my head from question period. But on the serious part of this, number one, appreciate the earlier point. I wasn't going to go down this path, but there is no papal infallibility of these officers of the legislature, and they can put themselves or be vindictive towards a government. Bonnie Lysyk went too far and lost credibility as Auditor General, attacking the Wynne government. There's fodder there, but she pushed it so far. I think Andre Morin, as the ombudsman, was another one who was more interested in being in front of the camera at the end of the day than doing their job. So I do think we need to have a check on their authority in general. Here, though, this is a relatively new Auditor General, and she's pointing out, I think, a significant potential flaw to the Ford government. And I don't think there's an intention by the Premier or ministers to pick winners. I don't see this as, this person came to the right fundraiser. I don't see that. I think this is a government that tends to run on instinct. And they say, okay, we heard this idea, let's run down this road. And sometimes hit the brakes and they run the opposite direction later. But when you're an instinct government, it's worked so far, and it works until it stops working. But you are vulnerable if you don't have a strong process in place to being accused of the kind of scandals like we saw around the Greenbelt scandal. They protect politicians that get pure decision-making. Third and final point, Dave, on this is the challenge, having been the opposition leader, is to sustain this momentum. So it's not just one day of stories, but to pinpoint and weave it into a narrative around your central critique of government. So we'll see if the opposition leaders are up to that, because sometimes it's awfully hard to keep that ball rolling after the first couple of days.
Well, let me just go back to the efficacy of the Auditor General, because and yeah, I remember this is 2018, and I'm going to say it was January the 24th, and I think it was a Wednesday, and it was a lovely morning, and I was on the round table with John Moore on News Talk 1010, and one of the other panelists was Vic Fideli. And after the show, Vic and I went and had coffee, and we were talking about the Auditor General's report. And Vic told me, we would never disagree with anything that the Auditor General would say. And then, of course, the next year, they were standing up and having to deal with Bonnie Lysyk and having to, deal with those slings and arrows. But to your point, Tim, around the idea that, they can get too far out over their skis. I begin to wonder, though, at what point do we need to be able to say, maybe to Keith's point, they're a little bit more focused, the reports, or that here are the 5 things that have to be done, and legislatively there is a requirement to put these in and address them within a certain period of time.
Yeah, I think Keith has a great idea. I never thought of that. It certainly would be an important check on governments of all stripes. You could have follow-up reports to indicate if something was achieved or not, or to specialize. So I like that idea as a good check on government. You probably love it in opposition, not so much when you're majority. but it does bring a better respect for process and taxpayer dollars. I just think that we need to make sure to maintain credibility. These officers play an essential role, that they do stay, within the guardrails as opposed to making it about their own image.
Okay. Question for you, Kathleen Wynne. Where were you when you heard that Phil Verster was stepping down as the Metrolinx chief?
I think I was walking the dogs.
And your reaction, or the dog's reaction?
Well, the dogs didn't react, but my reaction was, I think he's probably had enough. It was on my watch that Phil was hired. I think that he's worked under really challenging circumstances. There's something like 21 major projects going on right now. And I suspect, I don't know this, Dave, but I suspect that there's been a fair bit of frustration on Phil's part in terms of being able to communicate what he wants to. He's a very smart man. He's a good manager, and he knows rail. That's why we hired him. And I think that there could have been a lot more information shared. His hands were tied by the government, and I know that because when I was no longer the premier, but I was still the MPP in Don Valley West, we were dealing with the issue of the Ontario line coming through Thorncliffe Park and the storage facility there. And Phil Verster was very, very helpful in terms of convening community meetings with me. We tried very hard to get the Minister of Transportation, Carolyn Mulroney, to take part in those conversations, to be available, to even weigh in on them. We could not get her to. And so he ended up having to carry the entire water for the government. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, he was the head of the agency, but ultimately he was taking his instructions from the government on these issues of choice and so on. So yes, there were technical issues, of course, but in terms of the communication and the community involvement, that was something that the government would have had responsibility for, and they didn't take that responsibility. So I'm extrapolating from that and watching what's happened over the last few years, particularly on the Eglinton Crosstown, and I suspect he's had it. And it was interesting to me that there was a 2-week notice period. I don't know what that means. That's right. Very fast for an agency like that and a position like that. So we'll probably never know the backstory, but he's a good man. I hope he has a good landing. I don't know where he's going, but good luck to the next person. I will say he's done an enormous amount of the heavy lifting, and it's interesting. Today, there's an article in the Star about the TTC making an announcement about the Eglinton Crosstown opening in April, I think. So that timing's very interesting. Whoever the next person is, they're going to benefit from the hard lifting, heavy lifting that Phil Verster's done.
Well, I think the 2-week notice was this one and this one, both birds. I mean, that was it, and I'm leaving. I had this conversation with the comms folks on Now and Next this week, John, and it doesn't matter how you cut it. The history is going to say that Phil Verster was an unmitigated disaster. None of the projects that were under his watch are close to completion. And it's interesting. Bob Reed brought up the point around the TTC, saying we're going to back out of the plan to stop taking tokens and tickets in January, move it to June. And Bob, I think, makes the conclusion that TTC knows something about Crosstown because this was linked to the ability to take those tickets and tokens. So we're still 7 months out at maybe, in terms of being able to come close to something that is a deadline for Crosstown.
Yeah, I only have a couple of things to say uncharacteristically short on this, and that is it. First of all, outside of the GTA, whether it be Ontario Place or whether it be Crosstown Links, which is just up the street from me, I don't think anybody cares. I mean, this is not an issue which is playing in the living rooms of my relatives in Eganville, Ontario. It just is not. The waste of money may be in the process, but this is not. Secondly, I'm incredibly surprised at the fact that this has been going on for so long, as some people characterized it. It started out as an infant years ago, and we're now living with it as a teenager. where we don't know the story. I mean, those of us who live within a stone's throw of where it is at Eglinton and Yonge Street do not understand why all of the traffic has been snarled up there and all of the route across Eglinton is there. So, we have a viable media in this town. We have all kinds of scribes and investigators and almost everything else. I don't understand why anybody hasn't talked about this and given a good idea. So I don't really know what the thing is. I don't even know what is stopping it from being undertaken. And I don't know whether that's the cause of him leaving. But there's so many unanswered avenues here that all we can do is just speculate. I just have no idea what's going on, and secondly, why we haven't had any kind of investigation from the media generally just to unearth all of this.
Well, and I think that's a really good question, but here I'm going to throw another worm in the can here and try and sort through this, because I think part of this issue is who the hell's in charge. When we look at is Metrolinx an operator? Are they a builder? What's IO's role in this? And I think it's significant to Kathleen Wynn's point that this was such short notice that they had to install Michael Lindsay, who's the CEO at Infrastructure Ontario, to step in on an interim basis. And of course, he was in the media gallery in the studio this week when the Auditor General's report came out, because it was front and center, but he didn't get away without having to answer questions about Metrolinx.
At this point, I'm doing everything that I can in order to make sure that the Eglinton Crosstown, as well as other important transit projects, stay on track. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lindsay, sorry, just one more question. So what are you going to do differently that Mr. Verster didn't do to ensure that the Eglinton Crosstown LRT opens? Nothing else has changed except the person at the top. So what are you going to do differently?
Well, I'm going to start talking to partners and government, and I'm going to talk to the staff at Metrolinx. I mean, IO and Metrolinx have obviously been partnered quite closely in respect of major capital procurements and the management of the construction of these LRT projects. So I certainly don't start from zero, but I think this is a moment intentionally of trying to think about, with fresh eyes, what could we do in order to hasten the delivery of these projects, and those are the conversations I'm going to be having.
But the Premier did not give you a date in terms of when he would like it to be open?
The Premier told me to try to get the Eglinton Crosstown delivered as fast as we could.
So in the middle of that conversation, I saw you smiling, Kim, Keith, and the body language around this was very telling, because if you're watching on YouTube, you will have seen Michael Lindsay answer the first question and try to get the hell out of the Dodge. He dashed off stage left there, but was hauled back to answer questions. And I think it was really telling again. It was a good question. Did the Premier not give you some kind of marching order in terms of a deadline? And he says, well, we're going to try and get it done as soon as possible. There's nothing definitive in that.
No, and there can't be. I mean, if there was something that could be definitive, I'm sure Mr. Verster would have told us that before he left the position. I find it really unique that Doug Ford did nothing but praise him, even on the way out the door. It was a Kathleen Wynn appointee. And here's Doug Ford praising him, despite the fact that Verster became the political punching bag for everything that has gone wrong at Metrolinx, and the delays and the especially the Eglinton Crosstown, that he would take it on the chin. And I think perhaps why I don't know anything about why he would have left. I hear he has another job, but that would be just getting tired of getting beat up every day on something when clearly, and we saw this from Mr. Lindsay, the Premier's office is telling you what to say and when to say it. And the Premier's office wants this dealt with immediately. They're looking for a change. So I don't think Mr. Verster was forced out. I think, to Dave's point, he was actually, I've had enough. I'm bailing out. Screw you all. I'm gone in 2 weeks. But Mr. Lindsay's been handed just a giant ball here. And how does he juggle that and Infrastructure Ontario while he conducts a permanent search for a new permanent CEO? This is a major transit agency. I mean, what is it? $50 billion in projects or something going on? It's just astronomical. So it's crucial that they get the right person for the job. But right now, Mr. Lindsay's just, he's got one focus, and that's getting a date out to somebody for that Eglinton Crosstown. A bit unfair. I was reminded there when we saw in that clip that the health minister was standing beside him. And I want to go back to something we didn't talk much about, which was the also in the AG's report, with the supervised injection sites. Because the health minister was asked about this because the infrastructure, no one else was around to take the question. And her response was how Business owners and restaurateurs don't like seeing empty needles around and used needles and the paraphernalia that goes with this. The health minister talking about the business concerns. In other words, it's a populist thing. People don't like it. The Ford government's going to treat it like bike lanes. No scientific evidence. Boom. Why? I just have to ask why they're doing that. I mean, the health minister, instead of saying, you know, the Auditor General said as well, as we've heard from so many other experts in this field, that closing these supervised injection sites is going to cost lives. People will die. And we have the health minister saying, yeah, but you know, the businesses and the restaurant owners, they don't like that paraphernalia. They use needles. Well, no one likes to use needles around there, but to have the health minister use that as a defense, as opposed to, you know, when she's denied that people will die because of this, I thought was a huge misstep on her part.
Tim, I want to come back to the Verster thing, and you can comment on Keith's note around the injection sites. But to me, here is a systemic problem with some of these large infrastructure projects writ large. Because, again, talking to the comms crew yesterday, I've got Brad Ross on there, I've got Lindsay Broadhead, Anne-Marie Aikens, Bob Reed, all the folks who kind of, you know, are plugged into so much of what was going on in terms of the communications. And of course, they will all agree that the comms around this was a complete disaster and a failure. And whether you can blame Verster for it or not, I don't know, but he was the guy who was having to deliver the shitty messaging. So, but on the other hand, you know, they pointed out we don't have a CEO at the TTC. We've got a major job vacancy as a city planner in Toronto. Now we've got a major vacancy as the CEO at Metrolinx. This gives the impression that first, nobody wants these bloody jobs, perhaps because of the political bullshit that they have to put up with. And never mind, it's not like we're not finding good people to do this. You know, to Kathleen's point, Verster had the CV that we wanted. We went and did an international search and found the guy, and we got nothing.
So, you know, the benefit, the fun part of being a pundit now is that you can have no particular insight, no responsibility whatsoever, and no accountability when you're dead wrong. So I am going to wager that this is firefighting, that Phil Verster got another job that pays him better and probably a lot more glory and a lot less pain. It's surprising that a contract of that significance would have a 2-week out clause. I think when I left a far smaller organization, I had to give 6 weeks or 2 months as part of my contract. So this tells me, David, clearly he's got a job. I'm going to guess it's a very well-paying private sector job. You did see his compensation rise substantially over the years. He took on more responsibility, but I think also there are probably other offers. I think it's as simple as that, and the government's now scrambling to put the pieces together. You know, it's this is a multi-headed hydra. I don't know, as you said, who could ride this particular beast. I called for this sort of thing. I think it was important for all rail to be linked together. In fact, I had advocated the TTC be part of that. I think that is good for the long run, but it certainly does get kneecapped when it feels like almost day-to-day operations and certainly communications are muffled at the political level. Right, that's going to encumber any success, and most importantly, when communications are clearly smothered, that really undermines trust in Metrolinx altogether.
Well, yes, and I think that this question of is it better to be bigger or do we parse it off into smaller departments is one thing. But, you know, Kathleen, you will have a perspective on this in terms of, you know, the way IO rolled out these projects particularly. But I think this is a disaster for anybody who's been cheering for P3s, for one thing, because this is just has proven that they didn't work and they aren't working. And the more I talk to people about this, they're telling me that the guns are mistargeted, that yes, Metrolinx has to take some responsibility, but Crosslinx doesn't seem to get any kind of criticism whatsoever. And that's the consortium that's doing all the work, that's doing the building and the maintenance and the taking care of the finance and so on.
Yeah, I think that's true in the case of the Crosstown. I think that the consortium, nobody knows what it is, Dave. Nobody knows that it exists, right? And when I say that, the general public, you know, I mean, Metrolinx exists, but what's Crosslinx? And they know the Eglinton Crosstown. But so I think that is a problem. But you know, interestingly, when I was Minister of Transportation and then through my other portfolios, the public-private partnership model was delivering most of the projects on time and on budget. I mean, the big transit ones were a problem, but there were lots of other projects. There were infrastructure projects that were happening around the province that actually were coming in a good way. So I do not think we know the full story of what went on with the Eglinton Crosstown. We haven't heard from Crosslinx. You're right. We don't know what was under the ground when they were building. I bet there was a whole lot of stuff under the ground that slowed them down. And what I do know is that Phil Verster did not want to have the same disaster that happened in Ottawa in terms of getting an LRT up and running and then having it not function. So I think that, he's a cautious man. And I think that that in the long run will serve us well. But to the point about who would want these jobs, there is so much talking down of this city, particularly right now in the media. And maybe I'm listening to too much talk radio these days. But I think that we have to ask the question. If we want good people to come and be part of the rebuilding of the infrastructure in this province, we've got to support that process, and even on the part of people in government, like the Premier, who should be the biggest champion of what we're doing in the province, gets irritated when there's some congestion or, blames somebody and rips out bike lanes instead of looking at what's actually going on. So we have kind of ourselves to blame in terms of creating an environment where people are not supported when they're doing these big projects, which are complicated. When you're building big new infrastructure in a built city. I mean, remember when the big dig was going on in Boston? My sister lived in Boston at the time, and there was a huge hue and cry about how long it was taking, and it was a big mess. It was snarled because it's really hard to build infrastructure when you've already got a city in place. So I just think we have to listen to ourselves a bit about the environment we create in terms of supporting the people who are doing this work.
Okay, but to that point then, John, if we're going to do that, that's presumably why we've got Infrastructure Ontario in place to kind of have that, 150,000 foot view of the whole picture and to say this is going to happen here and going to happen here and going to happen here. They are the common denominator here in terms of the problems. And so if we look at Crosstown, we look at Ontario Place, and I'm going to throw a curveball at you. I've been following the story around the fraud charges in the building of the new facility for St. Mike's Hospital. And I just want to look at one of the headlines, and it said something to the effect that, what we learned was that these kinds of deals are struck all the time. Essentially, that was one of the defense arguments that, we might have broke some rules, but we break the rules all the time. And I.O. was at the table when those conversations were going. So it's a small thing, but to me, the leadership at Infrastructure Ontario, where's their accountability in all of this? Because, geez, you can't just say it was Metrolinx alone or TTC alone.
Well, I think both you and Tim have hit the nail on the head. Tim talks about losing trust, and then what you're referring to is lost accountability. And I don't see it anywhere with these projects. I don't see it when it comes to all of the construction and the road changes in the city of Toronto, which are marked with gridlock. And then every once in a while you get some report which says that, the efficiency is being increased and that, it's all going to be better sometime in the future. I mean, the city is in a mess, and it's kind of hard to be a cheerleader for the city when, there's large constituencies who are saying, are the politicians even running what's going on? I mean, is it just staff in City Hall who are making all these decisions? And there's, I hear constantly on the various radio stations when councillors are on saying we got blindsided by this. We had no idea about this. And I don't know whether that's because there's no chief planning person there or a CEO at a particular place, but there doesn't seem to be any accountability. There doesn't seem to be transparency. And I don't understand how we can expect to have confidence in a city or in a province or in a process if you don't have that kind of transparency. Like, honestly, if I just guess for a moment that the Yonge and Eglinton area was so difficult to get through because of pipes and electrical wires and construction there that had gone on for a century beforehand, well, then say it. Like, what's the problem with that? Or, maybe some engineering company misaligned the track by 3 millimeters, and because of the stress points, they actually have to relay all the track and make sure that it works instead of just gluing the damn thing together. That's an issue of accountability then, right? Like, who's going to pay for that if you misalign something? So something's missing from this whole thing, and it doesn't just relate to what we were just talking about, but if you go back with this government as well into the all of the issue with zoning and the land around the province, there doesn't seem to be any transparency, and there also doesn't seem to be much accountability at all.
Well, I don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but that was the whole point of public-private partnerships, was that we were supposed to be able to mitigate the risks, and the consortium pays in a certain level to get a returns based on the risk that they assume. But to John's point, Tim, you look at what's going on at City Hall, for example, and it just seems to be one group having their conversation in the corner, and the answer to congestion this week was the number of Uber and Lyft drivers that are able to be licensed here in the city of Toronto.
That old line in Scooby-Doo, that idea is so crazy it just might work. The version here, I think, is this idea is so bad the left on council might just do it, right? Like, why in the world would you want to turn Uber, which is working, into taxi? I mean, taxis suffered from over-regulation, government protecting licenses, capping all of that. And there was a miserable mess. And that's why Uber was so popular, and people demanded laws change to allow it. So why do you want to go back in time is beyond me. Number one, I don't buy this argument. And if Mayor Chow and those in council want to increase the wages of people in the gig economy, then they could start their own business or give a transfer, but making it more expensive for consumers, limiting choices, and especially outside the downtown core, Dave, there'll be a lack of Uber drivers, which means the Devon are more likely then to take the car for the day than to use an Uber for the last mile. And if you really want to get people off the roads, then improve transit, for goodness sakes. I'm on transit at least, say, 5-6 times a week, and the quality in the Yonge line has been abysmal. I really hope that they reject this idea. I think it's going to hurt ordinary, hardworking Torontonians.
Well, I made the point yesterday, Keith, everybody's looked at Uber when it came in, and it was, remember, the disruptor. And that's when we started to use that word. And we thought it was going to disrupt just the taxi service. I got news for you. It's disrupted all the congestion issues that we've got. It's actually added to the congestion. So I think there's a problem there. But to Tim's point, we need a broader vision of how we are going to get around downtown in the core. And is Uber part of that? Is the taxi part of that? Is transit part of that? For sure it is. But it's going to take some big thinking to fix the problem. And I don't think banning them or actually, restricting licenses in and of itself is anywhere near coming close to a solution.
No, I think Tim's right. I mean, you're literally trying to turn back time, and that's just not going to work for anybody but Cher.
It worked for Cher.
Yeah, it worked.
Yeah,
for
it did.
Cher. Absolutely. I want to point. When I was in Toronto.
Sorry, do we need a footnote in the show notes so the kids understand that reference?
Yeah, right.
That just
Oh, sorry, guys. Last week when I was in Toronto, I landed at Billy Bishop, and I normally take the shuttle, but it wasn't going to be for another 15 minutes, and it was late, so I thought I'll take a cab. I was going to call an Uber, but the cabs were right there. The cab from Billy Bishop to the Chelsea Hotel at Yonge and Gerrard was $16 before tip. When I took an Uber from the hotel to the airport last time, it was $30. I didn't realize Uber, if you book in advance, and I mean even 15 minutes in advance, if you're booking a time for like pick me up at 4:30, they had like a $12 charge for booking in advance. There's all kinds of things with Uber that aren't great. The worst part, though, is that they charge their drivers are averaging about $6 an hour when they're engaged. That seems really pathetic. And you can talk about the gig economy. It's just a way for billionaires to upset labor laws and ignore them completely. So I'm not in agreement with it, but I don't think you can't pull it out now. I mean, they're here to stay. Ride sharing programs are here to stay. It's a matter of how it's all coordinated, and especially, as you say, in the downtown core. But if we can't manage to coordinate the construction that's going on in the city, how are we ever going to coordinate all the different vehicles and transit systems that work as one cohesive transit system? I think we need to get all that construction sorted out first, let the projects go, and then have the street planners decide what can go on and what can't, because the traffic won't be able to move if we let these three projects go at the same time. Something's going to have to wait. We don't seem to have any of that coordination right now, and that's what we need to see from City Hall. And in addition to, and I'll jump onto another topic here, addressing development charges for housing starts, because it's apparently killing the housing industry as far as building new homes.
One of the things that we've talked a lot about in the last few weeks is, again, the provincial posture vis-a-vis what we're going to do under a new Trump administration, the trade negotiations, the threats of tariffs, etc. Generally, I think the premier has received pretty good marks in terms of his approach to this, his leadership among the first ministers, and this week started the Ford offensive. And last night, as we record this, did an appearance on Fox Television. I thought it was hilarious that his video didn't work, but he was on the phone making the case for Canada and Ontario.
Do you think it was a mistake for the Prime Minister to visit Donald Trump?
No, I don't think it's a mistake at all. Right now, it's Team Canada, and I'm glad that the Prime Minister went down there, the first leader of the G7, to come and visit President-elect Trump.
A lot of people say there's a big difference between your country and China, and that they're kind of lumped in the same tariff bucket. What do you think?
Well, I think it's unfortunate considering Canada does $1.3 trillion of trade, more than China, Japan, UK, and France combined. Ontario alone does $500 billion of two-way trade. And I might add, it's equally split down the center. And you were a big auto province here, and it's parts can go back and forth across the border up to 8 times. So the supply chain is very connected.
Donald Trump was making a joke with Trudeau in which he said, you could always become a state and those problems go away. But what did you make of that?
Well, the president has a good sense of humor, and, it's a funny comment. I guess he's still upset that, in 1812 we burnt down your White House, and he's holding a grudge after 212 years. But I understand his, he's a funny guy.
I got to say, John, he rung all the bells there. He said what he needed to say. That was 90 seconds well spent for the premier. It wasn't the most hard-hitting or thoughtful inquiry in terms of the guys on the desk at Fox. But here's what it occurred to me. This messaging is going directly to Donald Trump if it's on Fox. I mean, that's his audience. That's who's hearing it. And the Fox interviews aren't kind of drilling down on the Canada's ripping off the United States to whatever the surplus hundreds of billions of dollars is in trade. And they're not bringing that bell. They're not kind of banging on that drum. They're giving the premier the opportunity to state all of the benefits of having Ontario as a good partner. I think he probably won the day on that.
Oh yeah, I think he did. I think I would support the advertising campaign that they have done. I would support him going out and doing this again. The only thing I would tweak on is the fact that we're telling them that there's so much trade going on and we're great partners. But if I were selling a product into the United States, I'd be telling them about their benefits, not necessarily our mutual relationship. I mean, our trade with them, may be in big numbers of how much money is brought to the table for both Canada and the United States. But I'd be talking about the jobs. I'd be talking about in the United States. I'd be talking about how we are already contributing to the tax base there. I'd be talking about, in the small states, how many people within the manufacturing areas, not just in the cars, but in all the other areas are benefiting from this relationship. So the only tweak I would have is it seems, as you alluded to earlier, we can have this 20,000 foot conversation, but where it really matters is on the ground with something like this. And you want to make sure that people on the other side of the border know that they're getting a huge benefit out of this. It's not just a mutual relationship where we're both, getting some of the trade deals going.
Kathleen, when we look at that U.S. partnership campaign, the TV spot that they did around, to John's point, it may not have been as focused or sharply focused in terms of here's the numbers and the jobs. But if you look at the visuals in that ad, there are a lot of hard hats in that ad, and in covering a variety of sectors. And the benefit being there that the United States benefits from being a partner with Ontario and Canada.
Yeah, I think what Ford has done up to this point is great. I think that it's part of what needs to happen. Obviously, you talked about the Team Canada, the Prime Minister and the Feds have a huge role to play, but I think he's doing good work on this. And as I heard somebody say this morning on the radio, he's better suited to doing that on Fox News than Trudeau is. I mean, he's got the sensibility that would fly on Fox News. So I think it was good. The momentum has to build, and whether there's a completely coordinated plan between the province and the federal government at this point, I don't know. There certainly is alignment, and so the plan will come together as they go along. So I think it was I kind of think he hit it out of the park with that interview.
Tim?
I think Ambassador David McNaughton is sort of the best strategist in how to approach this. He was very successful with Trump 1 and gives good advice on Trump 2, which is not to fan the flames, to be thoughtful, reserved, and then look for the compromises that suit our interests and advance them as well as the Americans. I think the Premier's point, I think so far we've seen people following that line, Premier Ford and Prime Minister Trudeau. I thought Doug Ford there hit the right tone. You've all commented on the audience. I don't think this is about moving public opinion in the States. I think it's really hard to do, even though I think Fox has the greatest viewership of all the networks. But it's the decision makers, in addition to President Trump, elect Trump in the Senate and Congress, that are receiving that message as well. And I think Prime Minister Trudeau made an excellent move. The fact that he hopped on a plane immediately, it was low key. It looked like showmanship to address the issues directly with the president-elect was a very good move at the same time. So here are the two risks. One is if we have premiers out there that they get offside of the Prime Minister. So if we undermine the Team Canada approach, that's to our detriment. So far, they seem aligned, and that's a good thing. And secondly, just don't take the bait. Don't get into a fight. Don't get into an argument. Don't rise this up the political interest level in the States. As long as we stay on those two courses, I'm feeling confident.
Well, even to that point, Keith, the hair on fire response to you could always become a 51st state. I mean, Gerald Butts was really quick on LinkedIn to say, hang on, this is not the first time he's floated that joke.
I think Doug Ford hit the exact right response. Well, we burned down the White House. And it's just like
they're mad.
Actually, yeah, and they're mad. I mean, that was a great response, even though it was the British troops. That we won't get into that. I thought Ford, right off the bat, he was asked, basically it was a setup, was the Prime Minister wrong to fly to Florida to meet with President-elect Trump? No, of course he wasn't. That was the right, he defended what Mr. Trudeau did right away. No equivocation, no, caveats. Oh, maybe he should know. None of that. Defended it right away, Team Canada approach. And then later, he pitched the smart thing about the critical minerals. China's got a virtual monopoly on it. Come to Ontario. We need your expertise. We need your money to come to actually get at the damn things. But we need that, I thought, was the smartest part of his pitch. Because I thought he's got the numbers down, but he's laying out all those trade figures, but he didn't say in two-way trade with the United States, with you. He just kept laying out Canada's numbers. So it sounded like we could have been trading that much with the United States. So I thought he missed a little bit there, but I thought the critical minerals thing was a bang-on hit, as was the response to the 51st state thing. Make a joke of it, because Trump makes jokes, and he also makes some very off-color things as well. But I think the reaction to that is just, the hair on fire, as you said, is just ridiculous. That's what the online world has come to. I think if we didn't have social media, the whole world would have went, that's a joke, and laughed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a thread here. On the way out, he's cheering for, Phil Verster, and now he's cheering for Trudeau. I just wanted just a little bit more runway for the Prime Minister before he leaves the stage. On that, I want to get to Bonnie Crombie this week, because on a couple of levels, last week we had teed it up and we didn't get to use it, but we did talk a lot about the ads a few weeks ago for the pre-campaign campaign. And I think it kind of comes to light this week. So Crombie and the Liberal team put together another ad that wasn't quite as dire, but probably about 10 days ago. And I'd just be curious to get your thought, considering the move or the effort to put some distance between her and Justin Trudeau.
People across Ontario get up every morning and work hard. You put so much into this province. You take care of your kids and your parents. You expect to get something back. But every day, I hear that you can't find a doctor. Your kid's school is overcrowded, and you can't afford the essentials. You feel stuck. And every day you hear about another one of Doug Ford's friends getting richer, while you fall behind. Enough is enough. Your government should be working for you. As your premier, I'll make sure we're getting the basics right. Your health care, your kids' education, a home and a life you can actually afford, and a strong economy that brings the opportunity back to Ontario. So you can get ahead, you can ask for better, and you can get more for you and your family. I'm Bonnie Crombie, and I'm here for Ontario.
And if you were watching along on YouTube, you will have seen the way that logo is laid out at the end is markedly different than the previous logo. And I thought it was interesting, Kathleen, that this week now talking about the federal Liberals making a mistake with their approach to the carbon tax. And in terms of ads, there's a huge push campaign right now on the rebate that you're getting from the federal government. It's getting high run on radio, certainly. And so there seems to be a real back and forth here in terms of making sure that Bonnie Crombie is delineating herself from the carbon tax conversation that's going on in Ottawa, but at the same time, making sure that she's dealing with the affordability issues. This was a far better ad than the first one we saw.
Yeah, for sure. And I was at the Liberal leaders dinner this week, and those are the messages. So it's more for you. Enough is enough. And I think that ad lays it out pretty well. And yes, you are absolutely right. She is putting distance between her and Justin Trudeau. There's no question about it. As a Liberal, I want to know what the climate plan is, if it's not going to be carbon pricing, but that's a policy discussion. We're having a political conversation here. So I think she sees what's happening with the carbon tax across the country, and she sees progressives stepping back from it everywhere, and she's going to do that. Do I think it's a good idea or not? That's kind of irrelevant. She's doing this because she knows that that's where public sentiment is. The carbon tax, for a whole range of reasons, has gotten a terrible reputation, and we're not going to have snow this year very much, guys. So there's no doubt climate is changing, and we need an answer to that. But the politics of this right now is that the carbon tax is kryptonite, and she's moving away from it.
Well, and John, it kind of takes away the narrative. The carbon tax queen all of a sudden doesn't fit anymore.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, where she's come out in, on at least now 3 occasions where she's got a different tax policy where she's trying to blunt the criticism. So that was fine. Look, I think the advertisement was pretty good. I mean, compared to what went before, and they finally raised enough money that they can start to do something with a fundraiser event the other night where I think it was $1.6 million. And there's another one coming up in the early spring to try and raise it. She's also honing her messages. I thought it was kind of interesting that, as you said, if you're not on YouTube, you didn't see the actual ad, but it says Liberal and there's a heart sign, love Ontario, where I guess maybe some wag sat there and said, well, everybody thinks the Liberals actually hate Ontario federally, so we have to add that. I don't know whether or not the heart's going to appear on buttons or on campaign signs, but the reality was that it actually got Bonnie Crombie herself into an ad. I thought it was pretty well executed with her as a first introduction.
Tim, the question around the carbon tax, I think, has been a mistake on a number of levels, and not necessarily on a policy level, because I don't think people understand it well enough, first of all, or they don't understand carbon pricing generally. And it's viewed as the only answer to the climate issue that we face. There is a crisis, there's no question. But I talked to a guy down in Nova Scotia, Mahone Bay, he lives, and he is a guy who is into, we talked a little bit about this last week, about the biomass, biofuel industry. And his view is that carbon tax doesn't make any sense if we do not have an alternative to the fossil fuel. And right now we don't have anything that's a real alternative to it in terms of the amount of capacity that we would need in terms of energy to run our vehicles, heat our homes, everything else. So there are alternatives there. But I think that in this case, if Bonnie Crombie wants to take it to the next step, there has to be an alternative to Kathleen's point that makes it an obvious, understandable plan to how are we effectively going to deal with it. And it can't be up to me to deal with climate. It has to be a high-level issue that government and corporations are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting how quickly the carbon tax went sideways. And, I get that. You could probably write a strong essay in Economics 300 on why it makes sense as an inefficient tax. But voters have a fundamental distrust that they're going to get more back in refunds than they're paying in groceries, fuel charges, and home heating. I remember not too long ago, there were even conservatives, whether it's called the Center Ice Party or whatever, that were endorsing a kind of carbon tax. But now it's become political kryptonite. Look, back to Bonnie Crombie, I think this is a far better ad. It helps to brand her because the government will always try to cause a negative brand. And she's, I think, going after, two clear lines of attack against the government. One, that things that you care about aren't working. And number two, well, you're falling behind, insiders are benefiting. So it's consistent. My two caveats. I thought the heart was weird. Now, look, I don't speak emoji like my daughters do. Maybe it doesn't connect in the same way, but it looked unserious to me when it's being premier is a pretty damn serious job. And number two, there does seem to be a bit of a haphazard nature. I commented last show where you bring out one tax cut, then another tax cut comes forward, and the branding and then the Trudeau distancing, when it seemed to me, you can't do the Trudeau distancing, but there was so much fodder within 24 hours around the auditor's report that would have driven the message in the ad. So I still think they've got some wrinkles to iron out on their mechanics, but that's an improvement in the ad by a long shot.
Keith, the idea, though, that I think slowly here we're seeing foundationally the Liberals appear to be getting their feet. Yes, there's still a little bit of work to be done, as Tim points out. But when you trot out some of the tax announcements, as John has pointed out, there appears to be something of a focused or a more focused vision than we certainly saw even 3 months ago.
Absolutely, they're getting their stuff together as they need to do. I think what we've been talking all along about Doug Ford wanting a spring election next year because he wants to run against Justin Trudeau and not Pierre Poilievre, who's likely going to win the next federal election. Well, it appears that Bonnie Crombie's decided that she too would rather campaign against Justin Trudeau. And that's the carbon tax thing. Kryptonite, I think, is the bang on word for it because it's just become political nightmare to anybody trying to defend it. And yet, if only there was an alternative such as cap and trade, where the businesses and the governments made that work. We were in that. We were engaged in that. Were we not, Premier Wynne? I mean, that was the thing that was working, and it wasn't adding to our costs. I mean, corporations may have been doing the trade of adding some price increases down the line that got passed along, but it wasn't like, the guy driving the truck and the guy driving all the deliveries, everything being added in with the carbon tax, which has just made it so politically vulnerable too, because it doesn't seem to be a fair tax. So I think if Bonnie Crombie comes back and says, and we think going back to the cap and trade system is the way to go, it at least is an alternative policy to deal with carbon emissions. So I think that's smart. But, will it work, or will she be considered, will a lot of federal liberals want to stay home and not help her campaign because she's throwing Trudeau under the bus? I think they would probably recognize the reality of Mr. Trudeau shouldn't be leading the party into the next election.
All those door knockers.
Whole issue.
All those door knockers with bags over their heads will be those liberals that you're talking about who support the feds. All right, Keith Leslie, Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, John Wright. Thanks for another great week. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, and as we pointed out, you can find us on YouTube. We're also on all the audio platforms: Apple, Spotify, iHeart, etc. And of course, now lately, you can find us on the radio. We're on News Talk 1010 Saturday mornings, 10 o'clock. That's 10 Eastern time here in Toronto. And if you don't pick it up on the radio, you can always find it on the iHeart app. So join us there. And if you do listen there, I got to tell you, that's an edited show for time and F-bombs. I'm just saying. just to make sure that you're aware of what what you're getting when you get into the radio program. So yes, you can find me, DaveTrafford.com. We've got all of the shows up on that website as well. And not only do you get On the Ledge, you also get access immediately to Now and Next. And this week was a feisty conversation with our comms and strategy team, and some pretty interesting insights in terms of what happened at Metrolinx, because Anne-Marie Aikens, who used to be the comms lead for Metrolinx, knows Phil Verster pretty well. The interesting thing is, she was on a Via Rail train, and we did the show from the Via Rail train. So it was the first for us this week. All right, that'll do it for us. That is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.